When it comes to Formula 1 drivers, some drivers will have very long careers with a lot of success. Some will have their peaks later on in their careers, and some will peak so early that a few years later you'll be going, what happened to that guy? Take some examples. Jenson Button, for one. His success came towards the end of his career, with him winning the championship at the age of 29. Okay, he's not as old as Damon Hill, who was about to turn 36, or Mansell, who was pushing 40, or even Nico Rosberg, who was 31 when he won his title. But after Jenson won the championship, that was kind of his peak. He did win a few more races and did okay during his McLaren spell, but that then fell off when McLaren went into the Honda years, with him doing what was supposed to be his final Grand Prix at the end of 2016. But he did do the Monaco Grand Prix in 2017, while Alonso was doing Indy. He has still yet to serve the penalty he picked up in that race, by the way. But then you've got drivers like Alonso, Hamilton, Verstappen, Schumacher, Senna, Clark, Stewart and so on, who have had longer careers where they are often at the sharp end of the grid with one or two seasonal exceptions. Drivers who have had long and storied careers with success coming out of their back bottoms. Championships, wins, podiums, fastest laps and places on the all-time list. And where those drivers sit on the all-time list along with other drivers that I didn't mention will still be being debated while the sun is dying, expanding and enveloping 90% of the solar system in several billion years. But why stop at the successful ones? Because the likes of Patrese, Barrichello, Brundle, Trulli, De La Rosa, Heidfeld, Hulkenberg and so on have had long careers despite never having the success of the people that I mentioned just prior. They must have all done something right, whether that was wallet size or not. And fun fact, the last driver who made their debut in the 1970s to retire from Formula 1 was in fact Riccardo Patrese, when he retired at the end of 1993. That's a mammoth stat, and at the time of his retirement he held the record for most races started. A record that has since been beaten, if only due to the fact there's about 6 more races a season these days. Then you've got the ones who peaked incredibly early but then faded away. And the one I want to talk about today who did exactly that is Jacques Villeneuve. So was it skill issue or just bad career choices? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Being the son of a legendary driver and going into Formula 1 is never going to be easy. Just look at Mick Schumacher and Michael Andretti. And coming into Formula 1 from IndyCar, Michael Andretti is always going to be the benchmark. And while we're on the subject, the Michael had barely become a champion for the first time when Jacques started lighting it up over on the other side of the Atlantic. Villeneuve has got the distinction of being the last Indy 500 winner and last kart champion before the American open wheel racing civil war began, winning the kart title and the Indy 500 in 1995 while driving for Team Green. He still carried the Villeneuve name and was often referred to as the son of the late great Gilles Villeneuve, but Jacques was often able to race without having that tag being the difference between making or breaking. Unlike, Mick Schumacher, who had to endure the absolute pressure of living up to his dad, or Bruno Senna being the nephew of Ayrton Senna. And speaking of uncles, Jacques is named after his uncle who is Gilles' brother, so they are both called Jacques Villeneuve. And this caused some confusion when I did the video on the Caesars Palace Grand Prix because Jacques Villeneuve Sr., Gilles' brother, was on the entry list, which led to a few people going, shouldn't I say Gilles Villeneuve or whatever? But no, there were 2 Villeneuves on the grid that day. One of them happened to be called Jacques. And Jacques said, in response to people saying, did you think of your dad when you won races back in 1995? That's not the reason I'm racing. When you're driving, testing or racing, you're really busy and you're working hard, so you don't have the time to think about stuff like that anyway. It's really unimportant. When you start thinking about family or anything like that, it's more about things that happen in normal life. It's nothing to do with the work side of it. The difference between father and son is that Gilles had entered Formula 1 via Formula Atlantic and had to battle his way in, for want of a better term. Jacques had already won the Indy 500 and was on for the kart title when he did his first test for Williams in the summer of 1995. A test that did bring with it the whole, remember the last guy who tried this? Line of questioning. It was also symbolic in a way, because this test was at Silverstone, the same place Gilles had done his first test for McLaren. Williams was determined to not have a repeat of the Andretti situation. Villeneuve had got experience of European racing because he'd started in Italy in Formula 3 before going to America, which then took him into IndyCar, or kart as was. Williams, taking advantage of their financial position within the F1 pecking order at the time and also the ability to test 24/7, well, seemingly 24/7, put Villeneuve in the FW17 and he turned lap after lap after lap after lap. Over a 3-day test, Villeneuve was faster than Coulthard despite using an underpowered engine compared to the Scot, and on the 8th of August 1995, Team Green was told that Villeneuve would not be part of the squad for 1996. Because Jacques Villeneuve, son of Gilles Villeneuve, was going to be a Williams Formula 1 driver. More tests were conducted, and these ramped up when the kart season concluded in September, with Villeneuve doing another test at Monza that month. More tests were held at Silverstone later in the year, as well as places like Estoril and Jerez and Barcelona, because Williams wanted to make sure that JV was completely ready, and Williams would then have the best shot at taking the Constructors' Championship back from Benetton. And if one of their drivers won the Drivers' Championship, even better. Williams went with a worldwide satellite broadcast to launch the FW18 in the early part of 1996, with Damon looking like the proper English gentleman in his Rothmans branded suit, and Villeneuve wearing his trademark comically oversized ones. Apparently, he does it for comfort. So for the first round of 1996, the F1 world was left completely and utterly stunned. The rookie, brand new to Formula 1 racing at a track that he'd never driven before, none of the drivers had driven that track before, had managed to stick his car on pole. Something that had only ever happened twice before in Formula 1 history. With the exception of 1950, of course, Carlos Reutemann in 1972 and Mario Andretti in 1968 are the only two occasions where this has ever happened. Even though the official 1996 season review tape says that it happened in 78 for Andretti, which is, well, it's only 10 years out, but either way, I hope somebody was fired for that blunder. But Villeneuve had beaten Damon to the punch by just over a tenth of a second, and then beat Damon off the line when Villeneuve wasn't used to standing starts to lead the race, only for Martin Brundle to stack it in a massive way and cause a red flag. But on the restart, Villeneuve got the better of Hill once again, with Damon managing to get a much better start than he did on the aborted start and kept his second place. Villeneuve then led most of the Grand Prix, even managing to overtake his teammate as he exited the pits, but after going wide at the first chicane, he was told to slow down as his oil pressure was fading. That's because most of that oil was being sprayed onto Damon's car. He still finished second, but it could have been a win on debut on any other day. But then at only his fourth Grand Prix in Formula 1, Villeneuve would be a race winner. Jacques won the European Grand Prix at the Nürburgring while soaking up late race pressure from Schumacher's Ferrari on Schumacher's home turf, with the crowd firmly behind the German and pretty vocal. And given that it was the Nürburgring, perhaps alcohol was involved, with one person who worked for the media at the time describing the rowdy Schumacher fans as Belgians, but without the charm. Villeneuve had been a long way off Damon in the qualifying session, but when Damon fluffed the start, Villeneuve seized the initiative and went out to lead the Grand Prix. The previous year in 1995, Schumacher had won the race from a lazy by overtaking the Frenchman within sight of the checkered flag. There was only about 2 or 3 corners left to run on the final lap, and it was looking like the same thing would happen again in 1996. But Villeneuve soaked up all the pressure from the world champion to cross the line in the lead and win the Grand Prix by about 3/4 of a second or so. He'd now announced himself in a massive way. Jacques then retired from the next 2 Grand Prix. At Imola he had issues when he was tagged and given a puncture, but then had to retire with other issues later on. I think it was hydraulics. And then at Monaco he was wiped out by Bedoa's 40 as he lapped the incredibly slow car. There is no other way of putting it. At Barcelona, he rescued a third in torrential conditions and was then second to Damon at home in Canada at the circuit named in honour of his father. Another second place came at the French Grand Prix before getting revenge for the Canadian Grand Prix result at Damon's home race at Silverstone, which Damon crashed out of as his wheel played up. One of the bearings had gone or something along those lines. Jacques was then third in Germany but then got another win in Hungary. He was second to Schumacher at Spa, but then had a bad result in Italy after he went wide at a chicane and damaged the floor of his car. He then won the Portuguese Grand Prix, which is probably his best drive and something I covered recently, but he then retired from the Japanese Grand Prix. The title had gone to the wire in Japan, but it was going to be a very long shot. Jacques had to win the Grand Prix with Damon either retiring or otherwise finishing lower than 6th, scoring no points. And Jacques had utterly dominated qualifying, putting in absolutely unbelievable laps, but then bottled the start. Later on in the race, his wheel fell off and went into the crowd, so he lost the title anyway. But with Damon out of Williams for 1997 and going to Arrows, Jacques was now the favourite for the title in 1997, the same way that Damon had been for 1996. But it was more Jacques versus Michael than JV running away with it. Ferrari had made leaps forward over the winter, but it was still advantage Villeneuve with that qualifying performance for the first race of the season. Something that mesmerises me every time I look at it. and it's probably the reason we got the groove tyres in 1998. But Jacques retired on the opening lap after getting punted off, and the victory went to David Coulthard of all people. Now, I'm not going to focus too hard on 1997 because I've covered it all at length, but it looked like both Ferrari and Williams did their best to lose it. The title would go to the wire at Jerez with that accident on lap 48, and also factoring in the disqualification from Suzuka that Villeneuve had, and the other times that Jacques and Williams messed it up. And Schumacher was also on the receiving end of bad judgment calls, including the race at the A1 ring where he was penalised for a yellow flag infraction. But either way, at the end of that season, Jacques had done what his father never did, and probably should have done if not for his fatal accident in 1982, been the Formula 1 world champion. Jacques would be defending his title at Williams, but it was not going to be a fun time for him. Renault had left Formula 1 at the end of 1997. Williams was also without Newey, and the 1998 car was essentially the 1997 car made to fit the new narrow track rules for the 1998 season. And it wasn't just the externals of the car, because the engine was pretty much exactly the same. It was simply a rebadged Renault from 1997, but with a little bit of tuning, so things were going to be a bit difficult. As a result, Williams fell off from their early to mid-90s heyday. 3 podiums did come through the season, with 1 for Frentzen and Villeneuve taking the other 2, and Villeneuve did beat Frentzen for the second year in a row. But in the background there was a lot of chatter about Villeneuve signing for a brand new team. Villeneuve's manager Craig Pollock had convinced British American Tobacco to put up the money to buy out the struggling Tyrrell team. With BAT funding this new team, there was money to be had, and Pollock convinced Villeneuve that Williams was not the place to be and that he should come over to this new British American racing team. Matt Bishop wrote that being convinced by Pollock was a certainty, but the money was a probable motivator too. Adrian Reynard, who was behind the design of the car, claimed that the car would be winning races, but as we saw in the 1999 BAR retrospective, they had to actually finish the race before they could win a race. But that said, Villeneuve had proved that he could be quick without a Newey Williams Renault. He put that BAR on the grid in 5th for the San Marino Grand Prix, but he never got off the start line. And at Barcelona, he'd been running as high as 3rd before his pit stop. But the car was breaking down far too often for Villeneuve or the BAR to show what it was capable of. And then, at Spa, he and Zonta trashed their cars as part of a bet to see who could get through Eau Rouge without lifting, which was quite difficult in those days, even with a McLaren or a Ferrari. Because of that utterly atrocious season, Villeneuve was no longer seen as being a megastar. Hakkinen had overtaken him by this point, and it was Hakkinen and Schumacher battling for the championships while Villeneuve slid back down the grid. Over the next couple of years, there would be more drivers coming onto the grid that would also overtake Villeneuve in terms of star power. In 2000, BAR's results improved, with the team being lifted up to 5th in the Constructors, and then in 2001, the podiums came, with JV taking 2 podiums in Spain and Germany. But the issue was, in 2001, Jordan had beaten them through more consistent finishes, even if BARs were higher. In 2002, Jordan finished ahead of BAR again as they slipped down to 8th in the Constructors behind Jaguar. But by 2002, the likes of Jenson Button, Nick Heidfeld, and especially Kimi Räikkönen and later Fernando Alonso were seen as the stars of the future. In 2003, he completed another season without a podium finish. Also for that season, he'd been joined by Jenson Button, and the two didn't particularly see eye to eye. I'm sure Jenson didn't have that much beef with JV to start with, but Jacques had made comments about Jenson not being a racing driver and should have joined a boy band instead. The 5 years he'd spent at this new team that had promised so much and delivered so little had been a disaster. For the 2004 season, Villeneuve was going to be without a seat on the grid. David Richards, who was now the team principal at the team and his company ProDrive had taken over complete management of the BAR team, wasn't going to bow to Pollock's demands in terms of wages for Villeneuve. And it's actually quite ironic in a way because Pollock was now back to being Villeneuve's manager instead of being manager and team boss, because BAT had ousted Pollock from the position of team principal for David Richards. And there's actually some extra stuff here that could have rescued Villeneuve's career. In 2000, rumours were he might leave BAR and he could have gone to Benetton, and he'd also talked to Ferrari and McLaren about racing for either of them during the 2001 season. But the talk was, his management had done some bits and pieces outside that Ferrari and McLaren didn't like, and JV himself didn't like Ron's corporate mentality, which probably is for the best because of the personality clash that would have happened. At the end of 2002, Jacques had talked to Flavio at Renault and was offered a seat there, but pressure from Honda meant that he'd ultimately stay at BAR. There was also a return to the States on the car for 2004, but the same thing had happened with Forsyth as had happened with BAR. You want how much? Do one, and that never materialised. So Villeneuve was going to have to sit on the sidelines through 2004, but at the end of the season, or towards the end of the season, Jarno Trulli was unceremoniously kicked to the curb by Flavio Briatore, so they needed a stopgap. Villeneuve was called up, and he did the final sort of 4-3 races of the 2004 season alongside Fernando Alonso. After this incredibly brief stint with Renault, he'd be on to yet another team, in Sauber. Now the Sauber deal came after talks with Williams and BAR came to nothing. With the other teams happy with their lineups and signing younger and more consistent drivers alike, a seat at a competitive team was not on the cards. Even if the articles I'm reading say no competitive team would hire him, as if Villeneuve was terrible. Ferrari had the Michael and Barrichello and saw no reason to change because they were winning championships. McLaren had Raikkonen and had just brought in Montoya. Flavio considered Fisichella to be a better choice to partner Alonso, and Frank had got Mark Webber and Nick Heidfeld. At the same time, Red Bull had just come onto the grid and had David Coulthard for experience, and were more likely to put their own drivers in that car. And then the further you go down the grid, the less money there was to be able to pay Villeneuve's wage demands. I guess Toyota was an option, but they were already spending an ungodly amount of money on Ralph, so that's probably why that never happened. And the Sauber deal was seen as being a bit strange. Because Fisichella had gone to Renault and then Villeneuve had gone to Sauber, it ended up being a swap, in a way. Sauber did take a lot of criticism for hiring Villeneuve, and a lack of pre-season testing and lack of money available for the team, as well as the new regulations of 2005, meant that the car wasn't handling as well as JV would have liked. And in turn, he was beaten by his new teammate Felipe Massa. Both drivers would record a season's best result of 4th, with Villeneuve getting it at Imola and Massa at Montreal, but Massa scored more points finishes, 4-3. And when both cars made the end of a Grand Prix, Villeneuve only beat Felipe once. Moving into 2006, Villeneuve was going to stay at Sauber, but they were now the BMW team. Massa had gone to Ferrari to partner Michael Schumacher because Barrichello had then gone to Honda, and incoming was Nick Heidfeld, probably because they wanted a German driver. And it's the same story in 2006 as it was in 2005, Jacques beaten by his teammate. While points finishes came for Villeneuve, they weren't as common as Heidfeld's, and by the time the German Grand Prix came around, Villeneuve had 7 points while Heidfeld had 13, which is almost double. Maths. Now, in the interest of fairness here, Jacques did win the qualifying head-to-head 7-5, but then took grid penalties for engine changes at a couple of races, losing 10 places in total, while Heidfeld would get promoted up a total of 8 places because of other drivers picking up said engine penalties. At the German Grand Prix, Villeneuve shunted into a wall at turn 1, and after the race weekend, BMW Sauber issued one of those standard lawyer-friendly copy-pastas that Villeneuve would be leaving the team. His replacement would be Robert Kubica, who would later get a podium in that 2006 season. Was it because of poor performances, or was it because Villeneuve wasn't corporate enough or German enough for BMW? Answers on a postcard. There is a line here from a Motorsport magazine article that is something that should be mentioned, because the default argument going into the comments for this video will just be, he was never that good. But the thing is, he was pretty good. He just didn't have the longevity that a lot of other drivers have enjoyed. The line was, maybe he'd been in poor cars for too long that he'd forgotten how to be quick. It happens sometimes, but in any case, he never raced in F1 again. And there is a point to be made there, because sometimes regulations change and drivers can't adapt. Villeneuve, much like Schumacher, was critical of the groove tyres, and a few drivers like Damon Hill and Johnny Herbert and so on never really adapted to them. Although in the case of Hill and Herbert, they were in the advanced stages of their careers by the time these groove tyres came in. Bourdais also criticised the groove tyres when he came over from Champ Car. There's also the change from the 2021 cars to the newer ones as an example. Some drivers found it a little bit hard to adapt. But from what I've been reading from reports that came out in 1998 and 1999, drivers who were smoother tended to do worse when the sport switched over to the groove tyres, because the tyres were now harder so that they lasted long enough, and the tyres became twitchy as a result of the grooves and the harder compounds. So if you're Schumacher, that's your preferred way of driving. Villeneuve, on the other hand, despite his reputation for being aggressive, was actually pretty smooth because of his days of driving on the ovals. Post-Spanish Grand Prix of 2001 was also the traction control era, and having a lead foot was more of the way to be. So drivers like Villeneuve were going to struggle if stuck in old habits. Villeneuve most definitely peaked in the early years of his F1 career. The move to BAR was a mistake, but then at the same time, he probably wouldn't have lasted at McLaren or Ferrari because of his French-Canadian bluntness and loud mouth, as people put it. Also, if he had gone to Ferrari, yes, there would be the whole, oh wow, it's the son of Gilles Villeneuve now driving for Ferrari, but he was going to be against Schumacher, and that probably wouldn't have worked either. But Villeneuve can call himself a world champion and has 2 parts of the motor racing Triple Crown. Not many people have come from the States to Europe and hit the ground running. And yes, he did have a mid-90s Adrian Newey Williams, but he was still quite inexperienced in those kinds of cars versus what he'd come from. The kart machines of the mid-90s were completely different animals. They were monsters compared to Formula 1 cars. These days, we can see Jacques in the paddock doing punditry for Sky Sports, and seems to be his usual I don't care if this upsets people kind of self. Does he have some L takes? Of course he does. There are a lot of pundits that do. But he says what he thinks, and if it upsets people, then it upsets people. And if they are upset, then that's more of a them problem than him. And back in the mid-2000s, a picture appeared of Jacques with a caption describing him as a tugger, which really upset him, saying that journalists should use more professional language. Now, Matt Bishop, who was the editor of the publication that published said picture, asked Villeneuve if he would like to sit down with him and have a one-on-one chat, where everything that Villeneuve said would be printed without altering or redacting anything. And Villeneuve agreed. He always came across as somebody that disliked the press, but I think he disliked dishonesty more than anything else. If they were going to print everything he said without changing it to make someone look bad or make someone else look good, then he didn't want to do it. If it was going to be completely not redacted or uncensored, if you will, then that would be fine for him. I guess he just appreciates honesty more than anything else. And sticking with Matt Bishop, he wrote in one of his Motorsport magazine columns that Jacques was incredibly articulate in the interview, and used words like intelligent, forthright, tetchy and charming to describe him. Villeneuve was then asked, has F1 disappointed you? To which he replied, I won the World Championship in 1997 and that will remain. So in the end, people can write whatever they like. Whenever something is big, like F1 is big, it attracts wankers. It attracts people who don't have a personality of their own, but need to wear one of the team shirts so that they can go out to the pub at night and tell their friends, look, I'm very important, I do this, I do that, and look at my business card. Without F1, they'd be nothings. They'd just be wankers. And sadly, there are just too many of them. Did Villeneuve just describe those muppets on Twitter that make supporting a driver their entire personality a few years before Twitter even existed? That's insane foresight. But at the same time, when he did that quote that I've just read out, he then went, does that sound a bit bad? But Villeneuve is right. He will always be the 1997 world champion. But at the same time, he'll always be the champion that peaked early and then fell off a cliff. If Williams had managed to keep competitiveness in 1998, as opposed to being effectively replaced by McLaren and Häkkinen, who knows what kind of a championship we might have had. He'll always be labelled as whatever, but I doubt he really cares. But it must suck that his career ended like it did, through being sacked, and it being the ending that is the complete opposite of how it all started for him in 1996. But for 2 years in the mid to late 1990s in Formula 1, a French-Canadian singer-songwriter was probably the most exciting driver on the grid. So then, a look at the life and times of Jacques Villeneuve, the man whose career took a complete backward step after he won the world title. If this has been a fun look through the motorsport history books, then do, by all means, get a like dropped on this video so Al Gore and his rhythm will be pleased. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, then there's going to be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Or there's super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup or otherwise do a one and done donation, and memberships for Patreon but without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.